morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you're from. My name is Sunny Jain, and along with me, we have Dr. Christopher Jain Miller, we have Pratik Bansali, and we have Dr. Tushar Mehta. We're so grateful for all of you that have joined us today. I think we have a very interesting conversation that we would like to share with y'all. And it's regarding the deconstructing the science of pandemics and animal agriculture. Some of you may be aware of there's even a connection, and I think others may be hearing it for the first time. But in today's session, we're going to go deeper into the science behind it, talk about why it matters, and talk about what we can do about it as a community. Before I begin that, I just want to share a little bit about the Global Jain Network. If you haven't followed us or joined our rooms in the past, we're a club here on Clubhouse, and we try to have regular events over a variety of different topics. So whether it's regarding science, medicine, or it could be professional spaces, it could be cultural spaces. We try to have some diverse topics every week. And we would just love for you all to connect with us, whether it's on Clubhouse or on our social media. And we look forward to having future events such like this. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Pratik. And so Pratik, if you'd like to just introduce yourself, and then we'll pass the mic to Dr. Christopher and then Dr. Tushar. And so if you just want to share a little bit about who you are and maybe your connection to the Jain community space, and we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Sunny. So yeah, hi, I am Pratik Bansali. I'm a graduate student in the US. Right now, currently residing in the US. Came from India in 2018. And I do come from a Jain background as well. So, and being a vegan, just got connected with a lot of folks from you through Clubhouse. And that's how I got into basically activism through the Jain lens as well. So yeah, that's my introduction. I'll keep it short and I'll hand the mic back to you, Sunny.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll next pass the mic to Dr. Christopher.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sunny. Thank you, Global Jain Network and Jain Vegan Initiative for hosting this event. I'm Dr. Christopher Jain Miller. I have two kind of roles that I play. I'm the Bhagwan Malinat Assistant Professor of Jain Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. And I'm also the Chief Academic Officer of Arihanta Academy, which is an online platform for Jain studies that seeks to democratize Jain studies online worldwide with top professors from around the world. I am really excited to be here today for this particular topic because as someone who came into the Jain community sort of from the outside later on after studying Jain Dharma for so long, it's always interesting to me to understand how we can practice nonviolence, whether we're Jain or not, in a better way and through the insights of science. One of the insights of science that we haven't had a really big conversation about both within the Jain community but even outside, one that's lesser talked about, is this notion of the connection between pandemics and animal agriculture. So for example, if I talk to my family or friends and say, hey, do you know that many of the pandemics we have are connected to animal agriculture? They often look at me like, cross-eyed, like, what are you talking about? And the truth is that there is a connection, and really, I'm really excited to introduce to you Dr. Tushar Mehta, who's going to talk to us about this today, because it's such an important topic. And in order to understand the connection between pandemics and animal agriculture, we have to go through the lens of science. And in doing so and understanding the insights from science, we are better able and better prepared to practice nonviolence in a better way. So really that's the intention behind this. And I will now hand over the mic to Dr. Tushar Mehta to introduce himself and to tell us about the connection between pandemics and animal agriculture through the lens of science. Thank you all.
Thank you so much to all of you for inviting me to be part of this initiative you're working on, Global Jain Network, and glad to be a speaker. I myself, I'm a Jain as well. I am also a physician, and I'm also an activist for humans. I do work in Haiti and with other organizations that benefit humans. Very interested in local and global initiatives that will help humanity. At the same time, I really care about the environment, and I work with some environmental organizations and do consider myself an environmental activist as well. And I also really care about animals and ahimsa towards animals, and believe that people subdivide humans, animals, and the environment quite artificially. That really, when we talk about nonviolence and ahimsa, it's all one big tree of life, so to speak, and everything is really, really interconnected. And what harms one will always harm another as well, in various different ways and different levels. And that these are not separate issues; these are actually one big issue. And I'm a big promoter of that kind of thinking, of this integrated thinking about all kinds of human rights and compassion towards humans, animals, and the environment all together as one. I also do some Jain education, and as a person who's very immersed in the sciences, I like to bring the sciences together with philosophy and talk about Jainism not just in terms of how Jainism has been practiced in the past, but more about how the principles of Jainism are enduring, but our practices continuously evolve to incorporate new information and to and adapt to new situations in the practice of nonviolence, of self-understanding, of connectivity between humans and other humans and on all life. We have to not just be static in the way we practice the philosophy, but to be dynamic and continuously apply our principles of nonviolence, etc., to new situations as they arrive, and to be relevant to the problems of today and the future. Okay, so that's the kind of the background I come from, and yeah. So I have done a lot of study regarding plant-based diet, its impact on human health, environment, global food security, and also on pandemics. Because when COVID-19 came around, I was already somewhat aware of the problem of animal agriculture generating new diseases and transmitting them to humans, because this has happened in the past and I was aware of it. And then it hit us in a big way again in 2019, and brought our attention to this. Some of you may know Dr. Michael Greger. He published a book and did presentations on this back as early as 2012, saying that we're going to be hit with more pandemics. And that's not just him saying it. There was many people who were in the field of studying pandemics that were saying this, and they were right. Here we came with COVID-19, and there will be future pandemics as well. So what I want people to understand from this presentation is that is first understand, take into context the global footprint of humans and animal agriculture, how animal agriculture causes different mutations and generates different viruses as well as bacteria, but we'll focus more on viruses, and how that has created past pandemics, how it's created contemporary pandemics, including COVID-19, and how it puts us at huge risk for future pandemics, and how these are also entwined in human justice and, in fact, animal justice issues at the same time. So let's start. I always like to start when I'm talking about the science around animal agriculture with respect to food, environment, pandemics. I like to give context first. Okay, so the first thing that we got to think about are humans themselves, right? We have a population of almost 8 billion people on the planet, okay? And we grow at about 1% per year. So we add 1 billion people to the planet every 10 to 12 years, okay? Now, this percentage of growth rate may change a little bit, but there's a small variation in the growth rate can have a big impact on the future population. So by the end of the century, we can have up to 13 billion, or as low as just slightly less than 10 billion people, okay? But we have a massive world population. Amongst this world population, there's about almost 1 billion people who are living below the global poverty line. Okay, so that's less than $2 per person in your family per day. That's a lot of very poor people. And over the past 5 years, things have been getting worse. Since the pandemic, things have gotten a lot worse. So there was improvement for a few years, but there's been now a dip, just like, stocks can dip up and down due to many different factors. The human population has been getting worse off for the past few years and much worse off over the past couple of years. Moderate poverty is defined as like having less than $7.50 per person in your family per day, per day income. And there's over 4 billion people who live with that kind of poverty. At the same time, the global rich are getting a lot richer. Okay, this is very interesting. There's this divergence of wealth that's happening in this growing human population. Now we have so many humans. 10,000 years ago, if you looked at humans on the earth, humans were one of many animals that roamed the surface of the earth. And if you put all the humans on the scale and you put all the rest of the wild animals on the scale, like vertebrate animals, animals with a spinal cord essentially, right? So different lizards and snakes and mice and elephants and what have you, all these animals, you put them on, humans would make up less than 1% of the mass of total animals 10,000 years ago. But now, currently, we have crushed the wild animal population to be much smaller than it originally was, and the human population has become as large as I just mentioned. So humans make up about a third of the weight of land vertebrates now. A third. That's a huge amount. And livestock that we breed for our own use and consumption make up approximately 2/3 of the global biomass. And wild animals are probably between 1 to 5% of the biomass of vertebrate animals on the surface of the earth. So we have dominated the biomass of terrestrial animals with humans and our livestock. And these numbers you should think about because they are staggering numbers, and most people don't know this. Okay, most people really don't know this. And if you just look at chickens, chickens on Earth, an animal that is bred into existence by humans themselves, they outweigh all forms of wild birds. That's 15 to 20,000 species of wild birds. Chickens alone, one species, outweighs all of them by 3 times. So we should appreciate the scale on which humans are dominating the biomass of animals on Earth. Okay, when we look at livestock in terms of how much we slaughter, humans slaughter 70 to 80 billion animals per year on land. That's land animals, not fish. Okay, that's over 2,000 animals per second, mostly chickens. That's a massive biomass. But there's other animals too that are in large mass. There's pigs and ruminant animals like the goats and cattle as well. The human population has doubled in the last 50 years. And populations of animals that are measured by the WWF, Living Planet, and Royal Society of UK, that tracks animal populations, the animals populations have on average declined by about 70%, okay, from 1970 to 2017, so it's going to be even worse now, okay? We are crushing the animal populations at the same time as doubling our population, all right? Humans use up about 75% of the land-based surface of the earth, 2/3 of the ocean environment, and 3/4 of all fresh water systems are dedicated to human use, mostly for agriculture. And the world's biomass of plants has been cut in half by humans. So massive, massive, massive deforestation worldwide caused by humans. And humans now control a quarter of everything that grows on Earth in terms of our farmland. And our farms our agriculture occupies about 50% of the surface of the Earth. And animal agriculture specifically about 40% of the surface of the Earth. So plant-based agriculture just for human consumption takes up a small percentage of the Earth. But that small percentage still provides us with more than 60% of our protein. And what's going on here, I describe as ecological genocide. Most people are not aware of all of this. We live in our cities, we live in nice cities, nice houses, we live in our bubbles. But what's going on in nature is kind of out of sight, out of mind for us, and nature is being devastated. Okay, and all these animals dying in factory farms, etc., or non-factory farms, whatever the case may be, that's mostly out of sight, out of mind for us too. We don't see that on a day-to-day basis, right? It happens outside of our field of view. So what does this all have to do with zoonotic disease, right? I'm going to get to that because this is an important background information which you'll understand why it's important. So let's define a zoonosis. A zoonosis is an infectious disease transmitted from animals to humans. It can be parasites, bacteria, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, all kinds of stuff, and also viruses. Okay. Now there are zoonotic diseases like malaria, which is a parasite transmitted by mosquitoes. That's a zoonotic disease. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the zoonotic disease that come from animal agriculture. That's the focus of this talk because this is very important, okay? As in COVID-19, which we'll get to, which came from a wet market in China. All right, so let's talk about some general principles of zoonotic viral pandemics. Let's define pandemic. Pandemic is first of all, is a disease that sort of spreads a lot amongst the human population. There's no formal definition actually, but let's say a disease that that goes through worldwide spread. That would be an example of a pandemic, okay? As opposed to something that's very locally spread, a local thing that would be called an epidemic. A pandemic is something that spreads quite widely, like into different countries and so forth, similar to COVID-19 or influenza, which spreads everywhere, almost every year in the world, okay? Now, there are viruses in nature. Animals have viruses, humans have viruses. Most of these viruses, traditionally or naturally, stayed within their own boundaries, mostly stayed within their own species, within their own geographic areas, and there was a high biodiversity of animals and a high biodiversity of viruses. Humans, animals, and viruses co-evolved together and are mostly stable. For example, influenza comes from ducks and waterfowl, water birds. In the past, influenza just stayed within, let's say, a duck population and transmitted itself from one generation to the next generation of ducks every year and was mostly a gastrointestinal virus. It just infected the intestines but didn't really hurt the ducks. Because if there was a mutation of that virus that went and hurt the ducks and killed off the duck family, then the virus itself wouldn't be able to survive. It would kill itself off. So dangerous mutations would sort of self-destruct because you would kill off your animal population. But the stable viruses that didn't really hurt the ducks would continue to go generation to generation, and most viruses were stable. There was some transmission from one duck population to another duck population or from ducks to some other animals. There was some of that, but viruses generally spread more slowly and stayed within boundaries and were for the most part not dangerous to the animals in which they were co-inhabiting, basically, right? They're host animals. But things change with humans and animal agriculture, because what humans did was we started gathering large numbers of animals together, breeding them, confining them, etc. So in those cases, when a dangerous mutation occurred amongst a virus that was inhabiting these animals, normally it would just affect a very local population. It might destroy that population or hurt that population, but that's it. It would sort of stop there because then it wouldn't be able to spread anymore. But now, when you have thousands or even hundreds of thousands, or in some cases millions of animals caged together, when an animal gets, first of all, the animals will spread viruses amongst themselves. The higher amount of viruses you have spread amongst all these animals, the more mutations that will occur. Some of these mutations would be dangerous. But now these dangerous mutations have a chance of surviving because if an animal gets really, really sick and even dies, it will be spreading its secretions amongst all these animals that are in very, very close proximity. Animals of the same species, let's say there's a facility housing chickens or pigs or other animals, it will spread amongst those animals, but also amongst multi-species animals. So you'll have like these animal agriculture operations that have multi-species, traditional family farms in the past, or in older situations, we brought animals together of different species, And now in modern times, there could be multi-species farms as well. So you start having viruses crossing over between different species, generating even more mutations, and then some of those dangerous mutations being able to spread amongst these confined group of animals. An animal could get very sick. It could affect the respiratory system. The animal may die and spread all these different, but still spread to many different animals around it. So, in effect, the more the animals, the viruses that make the animal more sick can even have a higher chance of spreading when you're in animal agriculture operations compared to animals that were traditionally just in nature by themselves without animal agriculture. So you get all these different kinds of spread. And what also happens now is that you can have viruses that are in nature. You can have a bird in nature, but the bird enters or a bat or some other animals enters a barn or other type of animal agriculture operation. It could be a wet market, it could be a barn, it could be a factory farm of different sorts. And wild animals get in there, they may spread some virus into the captive animals, and then you incur mutations of that virus, which then cause problems. Also, the mutations, the different viruses that are within the confined animals may go to the natural animal, and the natural animal will take that virus and spread it to other natural animals, impacting them. So there's a lot of cross transmission from natural animals, wild animals, into domesticated animals, back and forth, and also then from our domesticated animals back and forth to the humans who interact with them as well. Okay. I should make a little comment about mutations. All living, all life has mutations. As cells divide, as different organisms reproduce, whether it's humans or viruses or plants or animals, we all incur genetic changes. So as you know, plants and animals mostly reproduce sexually, right? So you have genetics coming from mom, male, female, right? Combining and creating new genetic combinations in the offspring, right? And that's how you get a variety of characteristics in new forms of new humans all the time. Humans are not identical to their parents; they're always changing because our genetics are always changing, and this gives us a survival advantage because different characteristics in the offspring will always have different survival advantages and disadvantages. So you're always going to have this natural selection process going on. And that happens with all animals, but it also happens with viruses and bacteria. As viruses and bacteria divide, right, they may not in most cases divide sexually, reproduce sexually, they just sort of divide, but you get some mutations. And the different mutations will give the new offspring a different characteristic. So not every single virus will mutate, like one virus particle will not mutate. But when you have millions and billions of viruses and bacteria, there's always some small amount of mutation that's ongoing. And that will bring new characteristics to the next generation and next generation of bacteria and viruses. So this mutation process is always going on. And some of those viruses and bacteria, etc., will have different characteristics that will have various different capacities to maybe cause an infection and different survival characteristics as well. So that you're always having mutations, okay? The more virus you have, for example, if you have a large animal population and they're infected with a virus, that means you have a larger number of viruses, and that means you can have more mutations and then different characteristics for spread of those viruses. I hope that makes sense. I tried to put it as simply as I could, but it may be a little bit complicated, but I hope that makes sense. And we'll share a presentation that I did that's online that can also help you to listen to it again in a little bit more detail. Okay. All right. So there's very good evidence that wildlife, livestock, and humans transmit viruses amongst each other, that new mutations are generated amongst this massive population of livestock, and different virus variants will occur that can cause diseases to the livestock themselves. In some cases, diseases that will transmit back to humans, and diseases that could go back to wildlife and cause problems in nature. All right. There's very good papers on this, which I will have on plant-based data. So I'll encourage you all to Google plant-based data and scroll down to the zoonosis section. There's a podcast there, there's notes of the podcast, and there's a whole library of articles which you can take a look into, all right? So the role of animal agriculture is to, you have all these animals that are caged together or congregated in huge numbers, billions worldwide. These animals can be sick and stressed, and they can have reduced immune systems. We breed these animals, we collect these animals, and therefore amongst this massive population, viruses spread. You have a large burden of viruses. You get mutation and transmission amongst these different animals, and some of those mutations can cause sickness. Especially, you generate more mutations on multi-species farms, but certainly on single-species farms as well, especially when there's a large number of animals. The larger the number of animals, the more viral burden. And then you get some spillover from the animals to humans sometimes, okay? Now, what are examples of this? There's major types of animal agriculture are factory farming and wet markets. Those are the biggest forms of animal agriculture. Factory farming, we kind of know what that is. These are these massive farms where you're usually single species, sometimes multiple species, that produce most of the meat that is consumed in the world. And then you have wet markets, which they're sort of breeding or catching multiple different kinds of animals from the wilds and putting them together in these wet markets where they will sometimes slaughter them on site, and people will purchase different animal products there at the wet markets themselves. Okay, and then there's small scale and industrial and historical animal agriculture. So there, traditionally throughout history, we've had smaller human populations, smaller farms, but we're still congregating animals together. Not as many as the current wet markets and factory farms, so it's smaller in number, but you still have these animals congregated together, and over time, it's a slower process, but you're still generating different mutations. All right. All right. So we can talk about COVID-19 right now. COVID-19 came from a wet market in Wuhan, China. There's good science around this, showing that the human cases, the earliest human cases were clustered around this wet market, and the genetics of the virus that infected people were almost identical to the genetics of virus samples that were found in the wet market. Okay, when they were testing different sewage and different things, and taking samples from different cages and environmental samples from the wet market, and also from some animals, they found that the human COVID-19 matched the genetics of virus that was present at the wet market. So it's pretty certain, very highly certain. Maybe not. We haven't seen the virus exactly come from one animal to one human to start this. We couldn't track that, but we can see this, and that's pretty much like 99%, certain that this virus comes from there. And the way it probably comes in is probably there's bats that fly into the wet markets. They go around and they have urine and feces and stuff like that mixes in with everything else. People are also hunting bats and bringing them to the wet market. Bats contain many different viruses. That's just the way they are, the way they live, and the way they are. They contain many different viruses. Again, they're mostly on their own, but now when we bring them together into our livestock operations, we may spread the virus, or the bats may fly in themselves to these warehouses where it's a good environment for them. There's probably food for them there. They like these enclosures. They're kind of like caves. So these bats are always hanging around, pooping, urinating, and then probably spreading some virus into the animals that are there. Then these animals start spreading the virus amongst themselves and generating more and more mutations. And that's how probably it occurred at the Wuhan wet market. Now you have humans coming there all the time that are running the place and also so purchasing things there, and a lot of human traffic, and then people got infected from there, and then continue to spread human to human outside of the wet market. That's probably the mechanism that happened. Okay, so there's good papers on this, and what we call, the bat may be a reservoir host, and then the animals in the wet market, we may call them an intermediate host, which got infected, created mutations, and then passed it on to humans. Okay, so we call them intermediate hosts. And there's wet markets all over the world that are always generating these types of viruses, and it's a big risk. So SARS 2002, which had a higher mortality rate but didn't spread as much, occurred in a wet market in Guangdong, China. And in that case, it was probably Himalayan palm civets was one of the key intermediate hosts, but other animals probably played a role as well. There's also Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which is another type of coronavirus, which occurred from Qatar, and that has created this very dangerous virus as well. Again, it doesn't spread as much as COVID-19, but if you get it, it has a higher chance of actually causing a fatality. All right, so it has a lower transmissibility, but a higher pathogenicity. Okay, transmissibility means how easy a virus or disease can spread, and pathogenicity is how sick it can make you or how likely it is for you to die from that virus. Okay, so there's those two factors. And as we're always in our animal agriculture, continuously generating different bacterias and different viruses, especially different viruses because they generate more. Okay, it's those transmissibility and pathogenicity characteristics which will determine how dangerous a new variation can be. All right, and they can transmit and hurt animals within the factory farming system, and they can also affect humans themselves. Okay, so now there are other contemporary viruses that have come from animal agriculture. HIV is another example. This comes from the bushmeat industry in Africa, which we're talking about millions of tons of animals that are hunted and killed, and part of a trade system in Africa. It's not just some people going and killing some monkeys once in a while. It's a massive, massive industry that has been occurring over hundreds of years. But since the early 1900s, there's been a lot of boom in human population growth and increased hunting, especially of different chimpanzees and maccabees and other primates. Some of these primates had a virus called SIV, which is simian immunodeficiency virus, and there's probably a lot of transmission that happened repeatedly from hunting these monkeys and slaughtering them, butchering them, consuming them over and over again, that people got infected by SIV. But some of the mutations of SIV turned into HIV-1 and HIV-2. Okay, so again, another mass animal agriculture practice that caused repeated transmission into humans, and then certain variations in those monkey populations ended up having a devastating effect in humans, and over 30 million people have died since the global pandemic of HIV. And there's probably about 30 to 40 million people who live with HIV today. So it's been a devastating disease. All right. Ebola has not caused a pandemic, but caused epidemics, and comes from people hunting monkeys, bats, forest antelope, gorillas, and this consumption of this bushmeat periodically causes transmission to humans of Ebola and similar viruses, and then impacting human populations as well. So you get these outbreaks of Ebola that keep happening. Again, it's caused by bushmeat hunting, which is a form of mass animal agriculture. When it comes to factory farming, influenza A is mainly caused by breeding animals. And so every year people get their flu shot, or many people get their flu shot. I get my flu shot. And our mass animal agriculture systems, our factory farms, generate new versions of influenza A every year, and then they come back and cause flu in the human population. There's always tens of thousands of people who die of influenza every year. Now, there have been some pandemics. In 1918, there was the H1N1 Spanish flu, which killed about 40 to 50 million people worldwide, and probably infected about a third of the world population. That was generated not on a factory farm, but a smaller scale farm.
So,
And
Tushar,
again,
Tushar,
Yeah.
I just have like a quick question.
Yeah.
Like
Sure.
just trying to like also make it a little more interactive. So like,
Yes. Please.
is there like a difference in like mechanisms when it comes to like the factory farms, like all these like well organized slaughterhouses where you only have like a single species being killed in like that particular slaughterhouse or like in that particular factory farm, versus a traditional farm where you're going to have like a mix of where you are going to have like a mixed population of different species. Like how do you see those two things?
Yeah, so there's different factors that cause higher rates of mutation. So one is if you have a large number of animals, you will cause faster and higher rates of mutation. So it could be a single factory farm, a single farm with single species, but if there's a vast number, you increase the rates of mutation. Now on smaller farms, you can have slower rates of mutation. But so you might not see different pandemics coming every like 5 or 10 years, but you might see them coming up every few decades or something like that if you have a smaller population and smaller farms. But if you mix different species on the same area, so like wet markets or farms that have pigs and chickens and ducks and cows and everything like that, the mixing of different viruses from different animals together causes increasing mutations as well. Okay, so these smaller traditional farms, that's why the H1N1 Spanish flu 2019 came from a smaller farm, but it was multi-species, right? And so that can increase, that can increase mutations as well. So there are some variations, but overall, the idea is that when you bring a lot of animals together, one way or the other, you are generating mutations. And then there's some factors like the size of the farm or multiple species and things like that that can increase the rate of mutations even further.
Yeah. If I can ask, maybe make a comment, Dr. Tushar. First, I want to
Yes.
thank you. Just maybe to take a pause, and I just want to thank you for all the information you provided. For those that have been following along, I think a lot of us learned a lot of new information regarding, mutations, the origin of these, these pandemics, these viruses. And I think one thing that was really shocking to me was the idea that there's just so much overlap of different, I guess like fecal matter and different things within these factory farming and wet markets. Someone would probably think like from an outside view that it's a very sanitary process, that animals are separated by species, and just like from like a non-vegan outside view. But to hear that there's just so much overlap and just so many things that are happening in these markets, I found very shocking. And so that was something that I wasn't aware about until you said that.
Yeah,
I don't know if anyone else had thoughts. Yeah.
that's an essential part of the mechanism. Like when you have all these animals housed together, they're breathing the same air, right? They're coughing on each other. They have saliva. They have their respiratory secretions. There's blood. There's feces. There's urine. If you go into factory farms, they're living in close quarters. They're living in their own poop and urine and secretions. It's unavoidable. No matter how much you clean it, they're always pooping. They're always getting sick, and there's a lot of transmission of everything. So viruses spread like wildfire amongst these populations, and you'll have different viruses all spreading amongst all these animals. And then all of these different viruses are constantly reproducing and constantly generating mutations. This is something that doesn't really happen in nature, except in very rare circumstances in nature. It generally doesn't happen in nature, okay? And so this is a big biogenerator of viruses and different bacterias and antibiotic resistance, that too, but let's focus on the viruses because there's kind of the more dangerous. And so that's how we're doing this, and that's how we got these different COVID and SARS 2002, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. Different variations of this have caused HIV and Ebola. And if you're going into historical stuff, over maybe a longer period, we have smallpox, we have measles, different forms of tuberculosis, and other diseases that throughout history have killed hundreds of millions of people. Okay, so people don't realize that, you know, measles and smallpox and other diseases like that were originally came from animal agriculture. And it's very interesting also that animal agriculture mainly existed in Asia and Europe. Populations in the New World, so native peoples and Incas, Mayans, etc., in the New World, they didn't have so much animal agriculture. They never generated so many viruses. So when Europeans came over to North America and South America, they brought these viruses with them, and so many people got infected, right, and died from these things. But because they didn't have as many of these types of diseases already.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Tushar, for sharing that. If it's okay with you, I realize we've reached about the 45-minute mark, and so me and Pratik were wondering if it's okay for us to start bringing people up, and perhaps allow them to share some comments and questions, and if you want to share any thoughts in response, would that be okay?
Yeah, that'd be okay. I'm just going to make one last comment,
Yeah.
and that is that, just another thing that we should also think about is that we have this massive human population, and we're deforesting the world, right? As we deforest and as we spread globally, what we do is we should put our animal agriculture operations not in the middle of our cities, but they're always in the outskirts of our cities. So as humans spread, and as we continue to deforest and cause environmental degradation, we put our farms are always at the forefront of this environmental degradation, and therefore our farms are always getting new viruses as they're exposed to wildlife, and again generating more different viruses there, and this environmental degradation becomes part and parcel of this animal agriculture generating new viruses. The other thing is that the last point I wanted to make was that there are future viruses. We can get new forms. So what we were worried about in the future are new forms of coronavirus, new forms of influenza virus, and other viruses that have not yet affected humans but affect our livestock, like African swine fever, a new version of smallpox, etc. That as we continue this process of animal agriculture, we put ourselves at very, very high risk of generating new viruses that will come back and cause pandemics that could be even far worse than the COVID-19. And we're always getting infected. Every year, even this year, there's always new versions of influenza that affect a few people. And we track them, and there's papers written about them and so far. They don't really hit the media. They may kill one or two people, but they don't spread that much. So this is always happening, but it's only a matter of time before we get another big one, right? So animal agriculture essentially puts us at massive risk for future pandemics. And I just want to maybe end on that note as people want to ask some questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think most of us will agree that the information that you provided today, I think the average person has no idea that this is happening. I think, there's just so much, differing views and misinformation out there. And, I think, really providing a like almost like a painting of like from the start to the finish of how a pandemic occurs was, I think, very informative. And I would actually say that I don't know if there's a documentary that kind of highlights this yet, but I would love to see something that really kind of ties in what you said and visualizes it. Just how we have documentaries related to the environment, and we have documentaries related to health. I think this is something that I think could really help the world. I do want to go ahead and welcome a few new people, and also those in the audience. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll bring you up. Uh, Really quickly, I do want to allow Dr. Miller a chance to share any thoughts or feedback, and then we'll pass the mic to Dr. Priya and then Nisha, and we'll continue to have people join the stage as we do it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sunny. Yes, and thank you, Tushar, so much for your presentation and for all the comments that got started in the discussion, and for Dr. Priya for moderating some of that from a scientific perspective for us. I come in here as a Jain professor, and of course, the Jain tradition views the world as an interconnected web of life. And we can see from everything that we do to the natural world, to animals, to plants, to trees, the way we deforest for animal agriculture, that this all is really adding up to these massive moments of unnecessary suffering that we all experience, like the COVID-19 pandemic, which again, I've heard elsewhere and Dr. Mehta just said, could be a lot worse in the future. And if we start to really sort of incorporate this notion of an interconnected web of life, whether we're Jain or not, from an ecological perspective, it helps us start to see and understand these connections between the way we treat animals, the way we treat the environment, has an effect on ourselves as a human race, which is of course not separated from this vast interconnected web of life. And so I really think we need to take this very seriously, and I do agree with Sunny that some kind of documentary needs to come out about this if it hasn't already. I've seen short pieces, but something that really explains to the general public, like so many other great documentaries do, that this is a very serious issue, and that as the population grows, as Dr. Mehta said, humans will continue to interface more violently with the natural world and with animals, continue to contain animals and torture animals, and it's just going to come back time and time again to bite us. And science, looking at this from a scientific perspective, hearing from scientists, hearing from doctors about how viruses work on a very objective level helps us think about this objectively so that we can make rational choices. And of course, from the Jain perspective, from the vegan perspective, from the plant-based perspective, from the moral perspective, we really have to leave animals alone. And there's certain things we can do immediately as a human population to prevent this from happening again. So it's in that spirit really that we wanted to have this event. And I would, as Sunny said, I would love to hear from others in the audience, Nisha, as well as Dr. Priya, who also was making some great comments in the chat. So thank you all so much for coming and chiming in and listening.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Miller. And really quickly, I think you made such a great point that when if we reel it back to Jainism, right? So for the Jain community here, uh, when we do we do pratikama, we do samayik, and every year we ask forgiveness for even the smallest acts of violence, right? And so even if we hurt a bug, for example, we will ask for forgiveness for that. And to think that when we're supporting animal agriculture and the destruction that is happening to this world, is just unbelievable, right? And so I think even as the Jain community, we often talk about animal rights, but even when we think about the environment and what we're doing to the environment as well, I think there's something really there. So just want to share. Thank you for sharing that comment. We'll now go ahead and pass the mic to Dr. Priya. Dr. Priya, welcome to the stage. If you want to share any thoughts or comments or questions, please feel free.
Hi, yes, thank you. So it's funny that you guys talk about documentaries because there's a documentary in May or June that, full disclosure, I am involved in. I'm a medical consultant for, and I'm interviewed in, called The End of Medicine. It is directed by BAFTA winner Alex Lockwood, who won the BAFTA a few years ago for the short film called 73 Cows, about a farmer who was vegetarian and felt very bad about sending his cows to slaughter. And it's about his journey to getting all the cows to a sanctuary and going vegan. And he's now a veganic farmer. So Alex is the director. It is executive produced by Joaquin Phoenix, Rooney Mara, and Keegan Kuhn, who did Cowspiracy and oh God, why am I blanking on What the Health? And so the documentary started out being called Pandemic, and it started filming before the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And then the pandemic hit, and they kind of put the brakes on it. They changed the name of it to The End of Medicine, and it addresses not only pandemics, it addresses antibiotic resistance, it addresses the environmental racism, the diseases that are caused just from living or working near CAFOs, concentrated animal feed organizations, which are colloquially known as factory farms. And it's heavily science based, um, and it follows a veterinarian who was a pig vet on these factory farms before she stopped being a pig vet on the factory farms. And so, yeah, it should be coming out hopefully May or June. It filmed last year and the year before. It's taken a little while to get it into distribution, but the last I heard from Alex, it's coming out in in May or June, and I think it's going to either be like on Netflix or Prime or something like that. So it should be widely available, is my understanding. And another thing that people may want to watch is Dr. Aisha Akhtar's TED Talk, where she goes in great detail about how we get these zoonotic or spillover diseases. I think she talks a little bit about gene reassortment and things like that, which is a key factor by which we produce these viruses that can then infect humans. But thank you for having me on stage.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Bria. And that is so exciting to hear that we do have documentaries that will kind of visualize this to the general audience as well. I can tell you that the documentaries that do exist today have changed so many people, and it's actually helped people care about things that they may have not cared about, right? And I think even for just a person that cares about animal rights or the environment or health, it gives them information in a very digestible way to share with others. And so, for example, me not knowing much about the environment, two documentaries alone gave me enough information to be able to have conversations with others. And of course, it's a lot more complex than that, but I think it's definitely a starting point for spreading awareness. And then, of course, these documentaries in a visual way are able to portray something that sometimes words aren't able to. So, just really grateful for that. Um, I do want to. I was going to say one more thing, but yeah, actually, I was going to say one more thing about wet markets. I think I remember when the COVID-19 first hit. There was like a CNN video about how a wet market would look, and they actually had a kind of like a symbol that said "distressing images ahead," right? And so this is for CNN viewers, not for like animal activists and vegan viewers that would very much be affected by that kind of visual. And I remember seeing this video, and I just saw like essentially it was like a very closed and packed space, and there were just different species of animals caged in just the most horrific ways. And I mean, just to even visualize what a wet market looks like, I mean, it was just so distressing to see all these different animals caged up, being slaughtered in front of other animals, in front of other people, and it was just such a normal thing. It was quite shocking to me, and so I kind of just wanted to add that visual for because in the conversation about wet markets, just kind of want to share that it's just a really difficult thing to watch, and it's a very common thing in the world. Dr. Tushar, did you want to share anything?
Yeah, fantastic comments from all of you, and I really appreciate Priya being here as well. Dr. Utkar's talk, who she mentions, she's also excellent. She's written a book, and her TED talk is really great. She gives excellent presentations and runs an organization now that talks about animal research as well. It's really worthwhile to check into that. Wet markets are definitely a big source of generation and spread of viruses and other pathogens. But we don't want to just say it's wet markets. Remember, wet markets also exist in the West, so it's not just a China or Asia thing. It's definitely a Western thing too. And the next pandemic could be coming from from CAFOs, factory farms, whatever you want to call them. Could be coming from smaller farms. It could happen there too. And any form of animal agriculture. It could happen. It can happen from India as well. All right. So it's not that we want to blame one country or another country necessarily, but the world is responsible as we progress with animal agriculture. If we continue to do this, we're putting ourselves at risk.
Absolutely. Dr. Bree, did you want to add
Oh,
anything?
yeah, so I just wanted to say I've put the link to the TED Talk and the link to Lockwood Film. So if you want to follow along with them so that you'll get updates on when the film will be released, it's got a trailer in there as well. And then, yeah, I just wanted to echo what Tushar was talking about because unfortunately, this pandemic has resulted in a lot of anti-Asians, meaning anti-East Asian hate and misinformation about wet markets. We absolutely have wet markets in the United States. Swine flu originated on a hog farm in eastern North Carolina. 75% of pandemics, and this is not me saying this, is the CDC saying this, 75% of pandemics originate from our use of animals. And so this can, as Tushar said, happen at any time, anywhere. The problem is not the country, the problem is the system that we contribute to.
And also piggybacking on what Priya was saying, there are major social justice issues involved, right? When this pandemic happened, COVID-19, it affected people of lower socioeconomic status more. They had more death and more sickness, showing how the inequality amongst humans has devastating consequences for the people who are on the lower scale of things. So our human inequalities are really bad. What happened in developing countries? Many countries, I work in Haiti, there's not a single vaccine that's being given in Haiti, or at least maybe very few if it happened at all. But there's countries that basically didn't have access to vaccine. And the vaccine technology that we've generated, these mRNA vaccines, which are revolutionary technology, we're not sharing the technology with developing countries so that they can produce the vaccine themselves on a cheaper scale and vaccinate more global poor populations. These are massive injustices that are compounded and interacting with this already terrible system of animal agriculture. There's no good system of animal agriculture, really. It's always going to cause problems of these sorts and other sorts. But you can see that there's entwined multiple layers of human injustice happening as well. And just another little thing is that we also find that people who are on a healthy diet, a healthy plant-based diet, not a bad plant-based diet, but healthier plant-based diets, do have protection from getting severe illness as well. So again, another aspect where our philosophy of living, if we do it in a scientific, good, healthy way, can also protect us as well from this and other diseases too. So you see all these different threads weave together in so many ways, and healthy plant-based, healthy, sustainable plant-based diet is going to have so many different benefits. And at the same time, though, we want to consider things like other forms of human injustice that occur. Plant-based diet isn't going to solve all of those human injustices, but it's going to be a big part of that long-term solution, or hopefully shorter-term solution, that we would love to see in the world.
Tushar, I just want to say, I'm sorry, I know I've spoken a lot. I just wanted to let you know very quickly. There was a lovely woman who came onto Clubhouse last month. She's actually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
She and Peter Hotez from Baylor have created and sold a patent-free vaccine
Yes.
we developed specifically for countries that cannot buy into this egregious vaccine apartheid that is being supported by Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera,
Wow.
because they won't waive their patents. And so that should be coming on the market. It's going to be dirt cheap. They've already found people in India to buy it and manufacture it and things like that. And it will be readily available to every country to develop their own vaccine. So that's very promising.
It's an mRNA.
No. It's
mRNA
actually
vaccine.
through fermentation. I'll see if I can find the link and I'll put it in the chat. She was
Okay.
amazing. I've never spoken to anybody nominated for a Nobel Prize. It was really cool.
Right. Amazing.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
thank you. I did want to give Dr. Miller a chance to speak, and then if it's okay, we can kind of just move down the list. We can pass the mic to Nisha and Dr. Gina, and then we can kind of keep the conversation organic as well. So if it's okay, Dr. Miller, if you want to share any thoughts.
Yeah, that's perfect. It was just one last thing that I forgot to mention earlier that you all reminded me of when we started talking about injustice. And the first thing I want to reiterate, which has been said multiple times, is that of course, pandemics can emerge from a particular place in the world, and they emerge from different places all over the world. So we don't want to, again, promote any kind of anti-Asian or anti-East Asian sentiment, as Dr. Priya said, because this could happen anywhere, anytime, big farm, small farm, and who knows where the next one's, God forbid, is going to come from, right? So we have to just emphasize that, and at the same time, we can't deny where they came from, because we have to figure out what happened for every pandemic, right? And on top of all of that, one of the things that I'm not sure if Tushar had mentioned this, but is just that the animals themselves and their bodies are not necessarily just in one place, because these are animals that are being shipped all over the world, to different parts of the world, from Europe to South America to Asia to the United States, all over the place, and they're mixing and they're interacting and mingling, and as Tushar said, like, their secretions are spreading all over the world at a pace that has never been seen before. And so when we talk about having an interconnected world, we also have to think about that. This concept of having an interconnected world can have devastating effects as well. So we have to, what we're doing with animals, the way we're shipping them around, is compounding the issue. So that's all I wanted to say. I am also very curious to hear from others who are on stage, Nisha and Gina, Dr. Gina, anyone else. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Miller. We'll go ahead and pass the mic to Nisha. Nisha, thank you for being patient and listening along. If you want to, introduce yourself and maybe share any thoughts or questions you have, please feel free.
Hi, thank you, Sunny and Jain Miller, everyone. This has been such a fantastic talk and presentation and conversation, and really important. Thank you, all of you, for organising it. I learnt a lot, but also, you reiterated a lot of things that I've already been aware of. And this idea that Dr. Priya brought up about antibiotic resistance is definitely something that, should be concerning to all of us. The reason we administer so many antibiotics to these animals is because of everything that Dr. Tushar said about how we keep them, confine them in such awful conditions. And if you are already vegan, or if you've seen any, footage that animal rights activists have taken in these factory farms, even small farms, you see all the feces and urine that these animals live in, but also animals seeking comfort from like their dead siblings who have been, the carcasses of their dead animals that have not been removed from these places. So it really is like a breeding ground. My question was something, I'm not sure if it's a little bit different, but it's something I don't know that much about, that I've heard about before, but I was wondering if anyone on stage could like maybe enlighten me a bit more. You probably tell that I'm British originally. So moving to America 10 years ago, I realized I'm not allowed to donate blood here. And I learned that the reason was because I was alive in England during the mad cow disease scare, or like when the mad cow disease happened. And I know that was from cows being forced to cannibalize, basically, is what farmers were doing. Is they had all these diseased cows that they couldn't do anything with, and it was it was a problem for their bottom line, their profits. So they basically macerated all these carcasses of diseased animals, and they fed them back, or sheep's brains. All of that stuff is what I'd heard about. And so obviously I don't know if many people in the US or around the world are familiar with how much of a huge scare that was in Britain. People stopped consuming any sort of beef product, even like gelatin based sweets were just like, no one would buy any, no one would touch any. And then people kind of forgot about it, and it was like, okay, yeah, not it was forgotten about. But what I'm hearing is that this type of disease is called a prion, and it's like it happens from humans get it as well. They've studied it in cultures that cannibalize each other, where it's like a prion disease, and it lives within your body apparently, which is another reason why I'm not allowed to donate blood. Now, I personally am not worried because I've been vegetarian my entire life. I was raised Jain and vegetarian, but I was just curious because I've not heard about that, and that's like a silent pandemic that I feel that potentially could be waiting to happen.
That's really great that you bring that up. Prion is one form of infection. There's viruses, there's prions, so proteinaceous infectious particles. There are different types of mycobacteria. There's different bacterias in terms of antibiotic resistance. There's parasites. There's so many different types of pathogens which can come back and affect humans. And animal agriculture can be implicated in multiples of these, actually, and also be implicated in zoonotic disease like malaria, where you have different forms of animal agriculture which then promote malaria. And of course, it's not the animal that's breeding the pathogen, or in terms of our agricultural animal that's not breeding the pathogen, but we then may create, in some cases, more breeding grounds for mosquitoes that then transmit malaria. There's so many different ways in which this impacts us. So I think that prions, in terms of the relative numbers of people affected, prions are not causing a huge number of infections as far as we know. But to my understanding, and Priya can maybe chime in on this, or one of the other docs, I feel that prion research is inadequate. There is a certain amount of prion disease that is caused by animals sort of cannibalizing each other from our factory farms, like sheep's brains and cattle. Now, this still occurs, but we just don't feed cattle to cattle anymore. We may feed cattle to chickens and so forth. There's other things that are still occurring. And we may still be underestimating the amount of prion disease that's out there. And maybe in terms of the amount of dementia that exists in the human population, prions may be still a part of this, but we are underestimating the effect because we haven't looked into it deeply enough. That's an area of research which I think is sort of inadequate and deserves more research.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say the good news is, Nisha, the challenge is that there is no blood test that is ready for prime time that can look for prions, right? Because if there was a blood test that said, oh, okay, well, Nisha's prion negative, she can donate blood, then that would be perfectly fine. The problem is that you can be a silent carrier for prion disease, and of course, you might never have symptoms, like ever. Not even just it'll take 30 years for them to present for you. But if that blood were given to someone else, then they could develop Creutzfeldt-Jakob or a similar prion disease, and prion diseases are universally fatal. We don't have good treatments for them. The reason they're not so widespread is the things that determine whether something is going to be a widespread problem or not from an infectious disease standpoint is how infectious is it and how deadly is it, along with how it's spread. So the reason Ebola doesn't ever get to pandemic levels is because it's not a respiratory virus and it kills people real quick, right? So you know for sure, like if you're bleeding from your mucosal membranes, right, people are going to know that you're sick. So the reason that, for example, healthcare workers get Ebola is typically because they're running in to save their patients as they're dying and they're not taking proper PPE precautions. That's what happened in Liberia a couple years ago with the healthcare workers that tried to save the missionaries that had contracted Ebola. And that's how the missionaries got it, because they weren't protecting themselves either initially. And that's why they did fine when it was caught early and they were brought to Emory and things like that, because there's actually a huge process that goes into place at Emory. They actually train once a month on putting on PPE appropriately for diseases like Ebola. The scary thing about Ebola is there is like a herd of pigs somewhere, like in the Philippines, that actually can, amongst themselves, transmit an airborne version of Ebola. It hasn't jumped to humans, but that's a terrifying thought, and that may actually happen. But that's typically why prion disease hasn't been so widespread. It is certainly a concern because, again, it's a fatal disease and there is no treatment for it. But this is going to sound horrible, but from a public health standpoint, it's not as concerning in the sense that when people get prion disease, they don't spread it to people because they die pretty quickly from it. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say, but that's the reality of public health. And to your point, Nisha, you're not really at risk for it because you weren't ingesting infected animals.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Tushar, Dr. Priya, and Nisha for that question. And Nisha, even what you were sharing about the history of mad cow disease was pretty shocking and just really sad overall. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I do want to pass the mic to Dr. Gina. Dr. Gina, thank you so much for being patient and listening along. If you want to introduce yourself and maybe share any thoughts or questions you have, please feel free. And also, for those in the audience, if you want to raise your hand and join us on stage, it could be any question or any comment. Please feel free. We love having new faces here. And if you prefer to write a question in the chat, that's completely fine as well. So with that, we'll pass the mic to Dr. Gina.
Hi, everyone. It was not challenging to be patient. This was a great conversation. Thanks to everyone for presenting and organizing and adding in, information and questions and perspective. My name is Gina Shah. I'm a Jain, also a physician who has a public health background and a bioethics background. And I heard a few themes that I think are worth highlighting and considering how we, who are interested in these areas as members of the Jain community might want to proceed. So I'll, in no particular order, what I heard as one principle is justice, right? We hear a lot about animal rights, and what I heard Tushar say early on is that there is an important justice matter here that applies across human populations and in our relationships with other species, including animals. And we may know that there's a lot of talk about health equity. It's been magnified during the pandemic with what's happened in the US with an increased awareness of racial injustice. And it's like a buzzword now. Everyone's talking about equity. So as we think about raising awareness of issues within our community and then going beyond it to have more impact, I think it is important to keep in mind this language around justice and equity and how we can bring that in and not stick to just what's in the past been defined as rights, which comes along with its own political philosophical connotations. The other things that came to mind as I was listening were around how public health views pandemics and its role. I was at CDC during the first SARS, and I was deployed to Vietnam to help figure out what was causing transmission among contacts of community contacts of those infected in Vietnam. We had no discussion of the origins. I mean, there was already some literature out there, but you know, narrowly defined public health concerns itself with containing or mitigating when a disease has reached epidemic or pandemic status, right? So epidemic is when it's spreading quickly locally. Pandemic is multiple countries, multiple continents spreading quickly, right? So when it gets to that point, public health is like, what do we do to stop the spread? But there are other concepts in public health which get to the root causes, which I think we're talking about. So there's different stages of prevention. And what we're talking about here is trying to prevent pandemics in the future from occurring or worsening, right? So there's secondary prevention, which is screening, which is catching diseases early. Like when people say, we're focused on prevention, get your mammograms or whatever, that's just screening, right? Primary prevention is preventing something before it starts. In this case, if we want to prevent pandemics by stopping the conditions that promote mutations in viruses that spread rapidly, from animal and human populations, from continuing to spread, we would have to transform our way of producing food, right? We'd have to transform our relationship with the environment, our whole idea of how we interact with the world. In Jainism, our language around that is ahimsa. Parasparo pagraho jivanam. All living beings are interdependent upon each other. And that's important for us to remember when we're talking within our community. But if we want to transform how we interact with the natural world, we can't only talk among ourselves. I mean, it's hard enough to get our own community to give up dairy, let's be honest. If we want to have impact, we have to talk in a language that will speak to people who are not from a Jain perspective, from a Jain background, who don't know this Jain vocabulary. So it is really important what we're talking about, using the language of science, talking about spillover, talking about the conditions that, promote ill health. But there's one concept that I've come across, it's actually on the CDC website, that sort of comes close to what Tushar and others were talking about. And some of you may have heard about it. They talk about One Health. And that definition of One Health encompasses health of humans, the environment, and animals. And they do talk about it in the context of pandemics. I think it's a bit narrow. They're not really putting a moral or ethical spin on it. They're talking about how to prevent disease transmission. But it's something that we could consider working with further and developing in a way that promotes action. Like, how do we talk about One Health and promoting One Health as an overarching concept that goes beyond our Jain vocabulary so that we can have a greater impact? I'm sure it's about more than inspiring people with ideas. There's lots of, as activists, if we think about how do we promote change, there's lots of other things. Sorry, there's some background noise here. There's lots of other ways that we need to work, but those are just some starting thoughts. So I'll stop there.
Gina, I think you made everybody made amazing points. I guess that brings us to like, hey, what can you do? Like, what can we do as individuals? And number one is informing ourselves, realizing that we shouldn't just think about how to deal with this pandemic. We should think of the root causes and how the root causes occur, and we can talk about them. Then we can promote this excellent movie that Dr. Priya is a part of. the end of medicine. I think when it comes out, hopefully we'll all see it and promote it to other people. At the same time, I hope you can go to Plant-Based Data, the website that I'm co-founder of, and check out the pandemic section as well as other sections. And there's a podcast there where I did an interview, and my podcast is probably better than the talk that I gave today. It became, I practiced a lot for it, and plus we had some editing, so that helped. So you can check out the podcast and the reference list that's attached to the podcast, as well as a huge library of articles. If you're really nerdy, you can get into that. So there's good resources like this film and Dr. Utkar and Dr. Michael Greger, this fantastic book and videos about these pandemics, plant-based data as well. So there's some good selections to choose from in terms of learning more about this and spreading that information around, because we need to get people thinking about the root cause, not just dealing with the pandemic after it happens.
Have any of you guys seen Milked yet? It's out now. It opened on Friday for free.
Oh, that's good to know, because actually the team that made Milked used plant-based data as one of their resources. I want to see it.
Yeah, so Milked is out on Water Bear, which is a platform, I guess, where you can watch things for free. Water Bear, bear spelled like the animal, Bear. And yeah, so it's a film about the dairy industry and the lies the dairy industry perpetrates. And it's based out of New Zealand. New Zealand has a huge dairy industry. So I'm really looking forward to seeing it, but it is available now for free. I'm not connected with the film in any way, but it just looks like an exciting film. Another film that I am also not connected with in any way that I haven't had an opportunity to see yet is They're Trying to Kill Us, which was executive produced and directed by Keegan Kuhn and John Lewis, aka Badass Vegan. And that actually addresses a lot of what Dr. Gina is talking about inequities and how the food system has perpetrated this through things like food apartheid, lack of access to healthy fruits and vegetables, animal agriculture subsidies, things like that, that deliberately make it easier to buy things that are unethical and harmful to both human and non-human persons. So it just, in case anyone is interested in those two films, one of them again is Milked, which is out now, and then the other one is They're Trying to Kill Us.
And They're Trying to Kill Us is really interesting as well from the perspective of, it's a US perspective, and in terms of how air and water pollution affects, residents of certain probably lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. So I think the current number is around 200,000 Americans die because of animal agriculture waste. So that's like, sewage being pumped into water, like rivers, and then also air pollution from the ammonia that they use and all the different chemicals they use to try to treat these facilities that go into the air.
Yeah, Nisha, for the documentary The End of Medicine, a lot of the research I did looked into that, and we can find these airborne pollutants, and it's inorganic dusts, organic dusts, microbiological specimens, so bacteria, viruses, etc. Like a mile out from the CAFO. So people who live or work near factory farms have an increased risk of colonization with methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. And if you're colonized with it, you have a higher rate of infection, and that has actually been borne out. There's actually two studies that showed that. One was a VA, a Veterans Administration study that was done in Iowa near hog farms. So they're on multiple levels. It is very harmful, and these industries, they do this deliberately. They go into these areas deliberately because if you're a poor Black or brown community, you have no political power. And so this is why hog farms in eastern North Carolina exist. There's a study out of Duke, and this is a correlation, right? It's not a causation, but there are plausible mechanisms by which this would be the case. If you are a poor Black person and you live in eastern North Carolina and you're in hog farm country, you have not only do you have an increased rate of multiple diseases, you actually have a shorter lifespan. you will live a shorter life than a similar person from a similar socioeconomic background that does not live in these areas.
Absolutely. Animal agriculture operations, they locate themselves in poor communities, and they bear the brunt for sure.
Someone is asking about B12 and protein in the.
Oh,
Yeah, I was actually just answering in the thing, but go ahead, Tushar. I think you were going to answer the question.
no, actually, I have to find that. I was looking you up on Twitter, so I got to find
Oh,
this question in the chat
I'm
here.
I'm the veg doc on Twitter, and I'm underscore the veg doc
Insta.
on Insta. Yeah.
I just
So
added you on Twitter.
oh, thank you.
Okay,
So
let's
the
answer the
question
question.
basically was, I'm worried about B12. This is again to some degree propaganda. So B12 does not come from animals. I'll say that again. B12 does not come from animal. B12 comes from bacteria in the dirt. Animals are supplemented with B12 because by and large, the earth cannot support grazing animals. So animals are no longer ingesting dirt when they graze, freely. But here's an interesting fact, Harsha, that 40% of, for example, people in the US are B12 deficient. And I can promise you 40% of people in the US are not purely plant-based, meaning they are all ingesting animal products. So animals are actually supplemented with B12, and that is how we ingest that B12. So, what vegans do, or people who eat purely plant based diets, and I use those terms separately because veganism is an ethical stance, it's not a diet. But there are many people who follow a purely plant based diet. You just take a supplement, you just take a daily supplement for B12. I always tell my patients to take that because it's really hard to overdose on it. It's a water soluble vitamin. I mean, it can happen, but it's incredibly, incredibly, incredibly rare. And the advantage of taking the B12 supplement is there's no chance that you're not at increased risk of getting a deficiency. If you become B12 deficient, you can develop permanent neurological symptoms. And so that's why we should just all supplement with it, because it's cheap, it's really easy to do. You just take one a day, and anything that you can't absorb, your body will get rid of. You'll just basically pee it out. And then I think the other question was protein. So this is again, what we see is this is just phenomenal marketing, right? I mean, I became a vegan 11 years ago. I was a full-fledged doctor, and I had the same concern. So I had gone through biology classes, human biology classes, and I was so brainwashed by the animal agriculture industry that I believed that, right? But we actually get protein from all plants. That's actually where animals get it from, right? Think about elephants and horses and giraffes and rhinos and gorillas and all of these animals that only eat plants. We all get protein from plants. So what vegans and plant-based eaters do is we just cut out the middleman and ingest our protein from plants. The only people that develop protein deficiency are people that don't eat enough calories.
I think that those are that's pretty much in line with what I think as well. As somebody who does a lot of plant-based education, when it comes to B12, there, just to make it easy for people, right? Just to make it easy for people, I often tell people, listen, buy your plant-based milk, and I always promote soy milk, and I'll tell you why in a second. Buy plant-based milks and other products that already have a bit of B12 in them. They're supplemented with B12 already, so that becomes a constant source, because the more you spread out your B12 intake, you can absorb smaller amounts at a time. So if you're drinking soy milk 2-3 times a day, you're getting a little bit of B12. That's great. Other products too. Some people are better at absorbing than others, and when you get older, it becomes a little bit harder to absorb. So definitely supplements are going to play a role for the vast majority of us, and including people who are omnivores or vegetarian, but they still eat dairy or maybe eggs or whatever it is. A lot of these people still need supplementation as well. To make it easy for most of us, I just say, hey, take 1,000 or 2,000 micrograms of B12, even just once a week, and then plus eat those other foods, and you're going to be okay for the most part. Most of us are going to be okay with that. You don't need shots or anything like that. And generally, you can do it once a week. Now, some people who are more poor absorbers, you might need to take a daily supplement as well. But it's just sometimes a weekly supplement just makes it easier. And get your B12 checked like once a year, maybe. And if it's normal like 2-3 years in a row, then you can maybe switch to every 2 years. There's no exact guidelines on this, and the different doctors and experts who create guidelines, you can see there's differences between them because we don't have enough research in the area to give one guideline that's easy fit for everybody. But try to test once a year and try to supplement either daily or maybe once a week and consume products that contain B12. And generally speaking, you're going to be okay. And omnivores need to do it too. Okay, this is not just a vegan issue, just like what Dr. Priya said. When it comes to protein, remember there's different qualities of protein in the sense of some proteins are healthier than others, right? So animal-based protein, generally speaking, is associated with more cardiovascular disease, cancers, etc. And plant-based proteins can give you an advantage of getting your protein but reducing those diseases that are really important human diseases. So definitely go for plant protein and look for, eat plenty of beans and lentils and pulses and whole grains. Those are your major protein sources. And soy foods are also excellent, really high in protein. And soy foods get a bad rap. However, really scientifically, they reduce prostate cancer, they reduce breast cancer in terms of long-term consumption, and they're really good for your bones, and they reduce your cholesterol. So soy foods are demonized in the social media, etc., but actually the research shows that they're really good. Doesn't mean you have to eat it, but it can be a great part of your total overall diet. So beans, lentils, pulses, whole grains is going to be where you get most of your protein. Generally, if you eat enough healthy plant-based foods and you eat enough calories, you're going to get enough protein. But I find that there are differences in people's diets. I have a lot of Gujarati relatives in India. They eat too many calories, and the type of foods they consume, I can see, are very low protein. So they can eat too many calories and get less protein. So you can have a skewed diet if you're not really balanced. So generally it holds true that you're going to get enough protein, but people do have to look at their diet quality, make sure they're eating plenty of whole grains, beans and lentils and other things, and you're going to get enough. And there are some other caveats, but we don't want to get too much into it here. This is not a protein talk really, or a health talk. But there are a few other caveats, but I think that's like a general guideline that most of us can follow.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Tushar, I totally agree with you. The reason I don't recommend that people, and I don't think that's what you're saying, is that they rely on fortified foods. Is I feel like we're all terrible at estimating how much we're eating of fortified foods. So, that is why I recommend supplementation. I was,
Totally, I
I,
agree.
sorry, I'm sorry. Say that again.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And also because there's so much variation between one person and another person. It may be good for one person at one stage of life. 10 years from now, it may not be good enough for you. Or one person may be good with fortified food, another person, they may not absorb enough. So we do have to try to do that yearly test and take a supplement too. I think it's a good practice that we standardize, and that way we're catching everybody, right? So I agree with what you're saying.
Correct. Yeah. So what I wanted to just very quickly say is, I have a club called the Veg Doc on Clubhouse, and I've been a little less active on it recently, but I always keep my replays on for anything that is related to plant-based nutrition. And usually Dr. James Thompson and I do rooms together. He is a vegan allergy immunologist from Chicago. And so we have a room on soy. I think we did a room on plant-based nutrition 101. And so we're always trying to kind of make sure that people get that information. We don't give medical advice, right? That would be irresponsible, but we definitely talk about, we answer questions and things like that. If you actually look in my profile, you got to scroll way, 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 way down. But in the club Planet Earthlings, they did this amazing talk about animal testing for medicines, and Dr. Ukta was in that room. You'll also find the room on Corbavax, which is the room on the patent-free vaccine. So I just wanted people to be aware. If you're not super familiar with Clubhouse, you're not on Clubhouse very often. If you look in a person's profile, you'll find the rooms that they were in for which replays were on, and so you might find something that's interesting that Tushar did, or Dr. Christopher did, or Dr. Gina did, or Nisha, or something like that.
But okay, yeah, she's back.
Yep, sorry, I accidentally left the room. Yeah, so I don't know if everybody caught that, but basically I was saying check out the profiles of the people on stage, because any rooms that they were in or that they ran in which replays were on, you'll actually be able to go back and listen to them yourself.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for all those thoughts. I think we have some great links in the chat. I've also pinned the link to Dr. Tushar's website, PlantBasedData.org. We've also talked about Milt, which is a documentary that had just come out, and that's something I'm very interested in watching myself, as well as like sharing with our community, because I know dairy is really where it's at, and so having a documentary that kind of really just hyper focuses on that issue, I think will be really important for us, and will open up a lot of interesting conversations. With that being said, I know we have a few new people in the room. Just to maybe, and by the way, Dr. Tushar, Dr. Miller, I know we've definitely went over the hour, so if you have to drop off, please feel free. But for those that weren't in this room, we had an incredible conversation about the origin of. Yeah, actually, I don't even want to like try to missay it, but actually, Dr. Tushar, if you want to quickly just share what we went over today and what they can do to get connected. Dr. Tushar, are you there? Okay. If not, just want to thank you all again. We'll go ahead and make plans to close out the room unless there's any more questions. Pratik, do you want to have any final thoughts?
No, I think this was a great talk and like just a lot of information for me as well. The most interesting thing which might come across as like common sense now is like when Tushar shared about how like if a virus is like really, and of course like I need to read more on this, if a virus is like really toxic for one particular species, the virus is also going to like end up killing itself if if it really vanishes, like if it really wipes that species away, right? But only if it's like being able to coexist, then the species will probably also like over a period of years or decades or centuries or whatever will also develop some sort of immunity against that particular virus. So this was interesting, and like only when humans start breeding these animals and start like they have this close association with these animals, that's when they also maybe like mutate or like maybe jump from one species to the other. I don't want to like say it in a wrong way
Actually,
or like in a
I found that I was
technically
muted.
incorrect way.
I found that I was
Yeah.
muted, so I found my mute button and unmuted myself. Can you hear me now? It's okay.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah,
We can
yeah.
hear you
Oh,
good.
so
Yep.
if I was going to just maybe give a brief summary, we talked about how animal agriculture, global animal agriculture, is responsible for generating high numbers of mutations of viruses, but as well as other different infective organisms, and is the root cause of COVID-19, is the root cause of SARS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, HIV, Ebola, measles, smallpox, and other very, very important diseases. That we bring these animals together, that generates high number of mutations of different viruses and high numbers of viruses, and then these can then spill over and kill domesticated animals, can cause pandemics in humans, and can also go back to the natural world and kill, in effect, wild animals as well. And how this is intertwined also in various social justice issues. And that it's very important for us to realize that this is the root problem, and it is a major, major reason why we need to reduce, and reduce hopefully to the point of getting rid of, animal agriculture in favor of plant agriculture. Because there's pretty much no way of avoiding this problem when we're breeding mass numbers of animals as we are. I think that was, and some of the good things we talked about, some of the resources we talked about for people to check out is, hopefully, please do check out plant-based data. Just Google plant-based data, and you'll see the zoonotic disease section there, but also health and environment sections and economic section there too. You can also follow me on Twitter as well. shoot, I forgot my Twitter handle, but there's also at PlantBasedData. Okay, so you can find us on Twitter. Please see the movie that Priya is a part of. Dr. Priya is a part of The End of Medicine. She's also got a Twitter, Insta, and Clubhouse resources that you can check into, and that's going to be amazing to check into. I will for sure myself. And Dr. Aisha Akhtar was mentioned. She's also, I also know her. She's a kind of a friend and brilliant person. She's got a book and her TED Talk. If you look her up, is going to be amazing for you to see. And Dr. Michael Greger as well has some very good resources on pandemics as they relate to animal agriculture. So some good resources that we can all tune into, I hope, as well. Yeah, so hopefully that captures some of the main points.